When the world went to war in 1914, the Wright brothers had made the world's first powered flight only a decade earlier, and the airplane was still in its infancy. But the remarkable advances made in aviation during World War I are still at the core of air power today. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about the war in the air. Now, to say the first planes used in the war were basic is an understatement. Cockpits were open, and instruments were rudimentary. There were no navigational aids, and pilots had to rely on whatever maps could be found, which might even be a school atlas or a road map. Getting lost was commonplace, and landing in a field to ask directions was not unusual, as was flying low alongside railway lines, hoping to read station names on the platforms. But throughout the war, there was an upward spiral of technological developments, as first one side and then the other gained the advantage, and ever more effective aircraft replaced the basic machines that took to the skies in 1914. The first airplanes were not seen as offensive weapons, but as scouts. Even at the end of the war, the fighter types, such as the Sopwith Snipe and Fokker D-8, were still classified as scouts. Men on horseback were used traditionally to scout out the enemy's position, but they had obvious limitations. While the scout planes had a greater freedom of movement, a much wider range of operation, and the unparalleled speed to accomplish these missions. And aerial photography became a vital operation for both sides during the war. This was a continuation of the successful use in earlier conflicts of tethered, lighter-than-air balloons for reconnaissance, such as those used in the American Civil War. But flying reconnaissance missions was dangerous. The pilot was required to fly straight and level to allow the observer to take a series of overlapping photographs, and there was no better target for anti-aircraft guns or stalking fighters. And long-range reconnaissance meant flying well behind the front lines. Perhaps the best reconnaissance plane of the war was the Italian Ansaldo SVA-5. This plane, produced in both single-seater and two-seater variants, had a range and altitude allowing it to cross the Alps. And with a top speed of 230 kilometers per hour, it could fly fast enough to outrun enemy fighters. And here's a little side note. It was more important, if less romantic, for a fighter pilot to shoot down an observation plane than to shoot down another fighter. More than half of Manfred von Richthofen's record-setting 80 victories were scored against reconnaissance and observation planes. When war broke out, the number of aircraft in use was tiny. France, for example, had fewer than 140 aircraft at the start of the war. By the end of the war, she fielded 4,500 aircraft, more than any other protagonist. This may not seem like too much, but it doesn't give the true indication of the amount of aircraft involved. During the war, France produced no less than 68,000 aircraft. 52,000 of them were lost in battle, for a loss rate of 77%. The period between 1914 and 1918 saw not only tremendous production, but also tremendous development in aircraft technology. A typical British aircraft at the outbreak of the war was the general-purpose BE-2C, with a top speed of 116 kilometers per hour. Powered by a 90-horsepower engine, it could remain aloft for over 3 hours. 3 years later, the SE-5A fighter was powered by a 200-horsepower engine and had a top speed of 222 kilometers per hour, nearly twice as fast. Britain's most famous bomber, the Handley Page 0400, could carry a bomb load of 900 kilograms at a top speed of 156 kilometers per hour for flights lasting 8 hours. It was powered by two 360-horsepower engines. In 1914, it was important that aircraft be easy to fly, as the amount of training that pilots received was minimal, to say the least. Some pilots began flying combat missions having completed only 3.5 hours of actual flying time. For this reason, aircraft were designed for stability, but by the end of the war, stability had given way to maneuverability. The famous Sopwith Camel was, for example, a difficult aircraft to fly, but supremely agile. Many earlier common technologies became obsolete as the war progressed. Like, a lot of the aircraft in 1914 were of pusher layout. This is the same configuration that the Wright brothers used, where the propeller faced backwards and pushed the aircraft forward. The alternative layout, where the propeller faces forwards and pulls the aircraft, was called a tractor design. It provided better performance, but in 1914, visibility was deemed more important than speed. World War I marked the end of pusher aircraft. Now, as early as 1912, designers at the British firm Vickers were experimenting with machine gun carrying aircraft. The first concrete result was the Vickers Experimental Fighting Biplane 1. This was a pusher type of plane. This provided an optimal machine gun position from which the gun could be fired directly forward without an obstructing propeller, and also reloaded and cleared in flight. An important drawback was that pusher designs had inferior performance to tractor types. They were simply too slow to catch their quarry. So there was an obvious need for some means to fire a machine gun forward from a tractor aircraft. It would seem most natural to place the gun between the pilot and the propeller, firing in the direct line of flight, so the gun could be aimed by aiming the aircraft. It was also important that the breech of the weapon be readily accessible to the pilot so that he could clear the jams and stoppages to which early machine guns were prone. However, this presented an obvious problem. A percentage of bullets fired free through a revolving propeller will strike the blades, with predictable results. The Morane-Saulnier company designed a system of deflector blades, metal wedges on the propeller. Roland Garros tried out this system in April 1915. He managed to score several kills before being forced by engine failure, possibly caused by the repeated strain on his aircraft's crankshaft from the deflected bullets, to land behind enemy lines, where he and his plane were captured. The German High Command passed Garros' captured plane to the Fokker Company with orders to copy the design. The deflector system, though, was totally unsuitable for the steel-jacketed German ammunition, so the Fokker engineers finally came up with a machine gun that was synchronized with the propeller by using interrupter gear. They produced the Eindecker series of planes, and crude as these little monoplanes were, they gave a period of German air superiority, known as the Fokker Scourge by the Allies. The psychological effect exceeded the material. The Allies had up to now been more or less unchallenged in the air, and the vulnerability of their older reconnaissance aircraft, especially the British BE-2 and French Farman pushers, came as a very nasty shock. Everybody knows about flying aces, right? The dashing and daring heroes of their homelands. Here are the greatest aces of the war. Manfred von Richthofen, German, 80 victories, also known as the Red Baron. Ernst Udet, German, 62 victories, also famous for using a parachute to survive being shot down. Mick Mannock, British, 73 victories, the most victories of any British ace, although some of his kills are now disputed, in which case that honor falls to Billy Bishop, Canadian ace, 72 victories. And René Fonck, French, 75 victories, the most victories of any Allied ace. So there you have it, a brief introduction to the war in the air. It was during this period that the key tasks that aircraft could perform were experimented with and refined. Observation and reconnaissance, tactical and strategic bombing, ground attack, naval warfare, and with the growing importance and influence of aircraft came the need to control the air, and thus the fighter was born. Brigadier General Billy Mitchell put it very well, quote, "The day has passed when armies on the ground or navies on the sea can be the arbiter of a nation's destiny in war. The main power of defense and the power of initiative against an enemy has passed to the air," end quote. We will, of course, do future specials on flying aces and the actual planes used in combat. And also, we'll have features and links about aircraft of the war on our Facebook page. You can also see our bio special on the Red Baron right here. See you Thursday with our regular episode.